And hopefully we are now recording. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon on the second webinar in the Regional Heritage Stewardship Program series, this one on Know Your Collections, collections management practices. So just as a very small background to this program, I work at an organization called the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. We're a nonprofit paper conservation lab and preservation education organization. We're based out of Philadelphia, but we're a national company, and we are funded for this program through the National Endowment for the Humanities to provide preservation training and services throughout Appalachian regions of Kentucky, Ohio, and West Virginia. There is a recorded webinar that kicks off this program and explains everything about the background of this initiative. That should be available soon on our website, which will indicate a link to at the end of the program. So if you need to know more about the program, please check out our website and the webinar that will be linked up there shortly. So this afternoon, we are going to talk about some of the collections management issues in dealing with cultural collections. We're going to start out talking in terms of policies and then drill down to define some of the bones behind the policies themselves. So often when we think about the words collections management, we're thinking in terms of a collections management policy, but really collections management and the practices and actions that are involved in that are much more than just the written policy itself. So that's what we're going to get into this afternoon, somewhat of the background. So what exactly is collections management? Here I've provided some fairly lengthy definitions, at least lengthy for a PowerPoint slide. We don't have to read through all of them, but just want to bring your attention to the idea that they all have the same general concepts included. Some of them are more focused on physical care. Some are more focused on administration and bigger picture questions. But what they all really come down to is that collections management entails what the collections are and how we work with the collections. So as I mentioned, many of the times that we hear that term, it's in relation to a collections management policy. So just as a little bit of background on the framework of the type of written or conceptual document that might define an institution's collections management practices, I did want to start by talking about this policy. So a collections management policy, of course, is simply a detailed statement of why an institution is in operation and how it goes about its business. That is, what the collections are and how we work with the collections. As I mentioned, the very simple definition of collections management itself. The purposes of a collections management policy are to really serve as a guide for the staff. That's probably the most critical and important purpose of this policy. It serves to articulate professional standards and show that an institution is striving to maintain those standards. And it describes the relationship among the organization and its collections, as well as its authorities and staff and the outside world. So for many cultural collecting institutions, what a collections management policy is really going to do is basically define the scope of the collection, give you the authority, that is, give the collection staff the authority to undertake collections management initiatives, and provide guidelines for undertaking those practices. Here's a sample of table of contents for a collections management policy, just to show you that it really can contain anything and everything related to the care and management of collections. So everything from the mission statement to how the collection is built, how the collection may be winnowed down through deaccessions and disposals, Issues like dealing with loans, documentation, collections care and preservation, access and possibly even handling, and possibly even intellectual property. So we're not going to talk about every single section of this today in really great detail, but we are going to go through some of the big ones. But basically, a collections management policy, having a written statement and having these written guidelines in place can really help to answer some of the difficult questions that institutions might be facing. For example, some very common questions that I've heard from numerous different shapes and sizes of cultural collecting institutions. We have collections, but we aren't sure that we own them. What are the implications? We have collections and don't want them anymore. How can we dispose of them, and what are the procedures that we need to take in order to do that? We keep getting objects or getting offered objects that we don't really want. How can we control this? So some of these questions are entailed also in a collections development policy or statement. I want to differentiate now between a collections management policy and a collections development policy. A collections management policy is much bigger than the collections development policy. The collections development policy is going to go into a lot of detail about explaining what the collections are and articulating some of the policies around growing the collections and possibly getting into deaccessions. But the collections management policy, this is really the big framework, the overall guiding document that drives how an institution works with its collections. The policy can only take you so far, but if you don't have one, or if you have an ill-defined policy or a policy that's so out of date that it's essentially irrelevant, or a policy that different staff members or different volunteers aren't necessarily agreeing upon, if you don't have that up-to-date, accurate collections management policy, your institution, your collections don't have that guiding framework in order to undertake all of these collections management actions. So I mentioned that a collections development policy and or a collections development section of an overall collections management policy is really articulating and describing what exactly the collection is. So the collection needs to work in tandem with the larger mission of an organization, and in the collections development policy or in a collections development statement in a bigger policy, your institution would articulate how your collection fits in with the overall mission of the organization. The collections development policy or statement is really a conceptual framework and a collecting philosophy for how the collections support the institutional mission through interpretation, exhibitions, programming, research, use, any way that the collections will be used, those should fit into that conceptual framework of the organization. A collections development policy should be specific enough to help with decisions, should articulate the big ideas and goals of what your institution collects. Within this policy or statement, you can outline not only areas of scope, such as dates, subject matter, regions, geographic regions, formats, materials. We'll get into that a little more in the next slide. But you can not only articulate what you do collect and explain the strengths and the real backbone subjects and areas and formats and all that of the collection, but you can also articulate gaps, for example, mission-driven areas that are underrepresented in the collection that perhaps you might want to pursue and build greater in if you're with an organization that is doing more collecting. A collections development policy might articulate limits. For example, what won't be collected. Sometimes you can explicitly state what you don't want to accept. For example, things that don't directly relate to your mission, things that are already overrepresented in the collections that you do have. A collections development policy might call to identifying the resources that your institution or repository will devote to the collection. It might get into matters like your collecting philosophy. So for example, how do you collect materials? Are you actively going out and seeking and possibly even purchasing collections? Are you in a state of passive collecting, which means that your organization is essentially waiting for donors to bring collections to you? Are you doing are you with an organization where it would be relevant and your staff are doing field collections? For example, science collections, natural history collections, where representatives of the organization are actually out in the field gathering materials. All of those would be articulated in this collections development policy. So this policy or this statement, as I mentioned, describes in detail what a repository will collect and the breadth and scope of the collections by articulating and possibly limiting the collected dates, subjects, regions, formats, etc., possibly languages that you will and won't collect. As I mentioned, it can identify and outline gaps in the collections and designate areas for concentration in future collection. It might identify materials that might be out of scope and therefore targets for deaccessioning, and might also help limit unsolicited donations. Now, I don't mean that the written policy or statement would spell that out, but I mean in the process of articulating this, in the process of writing or refining a collection development policy, some of those questions might be answered. In other words, a collections development policy or statement would give your institution a way to accept things that you want and to turn down objects that don't fit your mission, that you can't take care of, or that are offered with strings or restrictions that you can't fulfill. So think about the way that your collections policy, development policy, or statement addresses the relationship between your missions and your collections. By accepting something at an organization, you are making a commitment to take care of it. You are making a commitment to undertake all of these collections management practices that we're about to talk about in the rest of this webinar. So if you can't do that, if you can't make that commitment confidently, really you shouldn't accept the material. For example, if you're faced with a donation of electronic records, digital materials that you know that you don't have a digital preservation plan in place, or that they require audiovisual materials that require equipment and listening or viewing devices that you just don't have in-house, possibly that would be a reason to not accept the material. Okay, so drilling in, I said that we were going to start by talking about what might be comprised in the written policy statements and really the conceptual policy frameworks as well. But drilling into those policies, I want to kind of go through that previous slide about what might be included in the contents of a collections management policy and really drill down and define all of the different actions that might be entailed. So first off, we're going to talk about how the collection grows. So how materials come into a collection, become part of an institution's collection. I have here a slide with the 3 A's: acquisition, appraisal, and accession. So these are 3 different words about accepting materials into into the collections. These are 3 words about collections growth. They all do happen to begin with A, but they all have different definitions. Some of them kind of only slightly nuanced different, and some of them you know, there might be confusion, or maybe in the past you or your institution has inadvertently used some of these words, especially acquisition and accession, interchangeably, or mix them up to a certain extent. It's a very, very common to not necessarily differentiate between those two, but they do have different definitions, so I'm going to drill into what those are. So starting off, we're going kind of in order of how the process might happen. So the first step is acquisition. The acquisition of an item, of an object, of a collection is basically just that material coming in the door, walking over the threshold of your institution. Once you get an object, even if you are not going to accept it, once it comes to you, it's an acquisition. And I'll explain a little more, of course, what I mean by that. So on this slide, I've just listed out, as I mentioned a bit previously in the collections development section, how different types of acquisitions can be made. So of course, gifts or donations, bequest would be when material was, for example, left to an organization in someone's will or estate. Of course, purchase, field collections, actually going out and collecting in the field, and then conversion from found-in collections. I'll talk in more detail about what that means in a little bit, and also transfer from a different collection or different department within the institution. So at this first step, at this acquisition step, as I mentioned, this is basically when something comes in and your organizational staff are in the position of deciding whether you want it for your collections. And this is, of course, this all gets very complex, but we're talking about this in simple terms, as if it ever is a step-by-step process. It's never quite this easy, but if it were. Some of the considerations that you might articulate in an acquisition policy or in the acquisition section of a collections management policy would be just the policies and guidelines that your staff and people interested in donating materials need to know in order to determine whether materials would be accepted formally into your collections. So an acquisition policy would outline the conditions or terms that would affect an acquisition or the materials. It would define who makes acquisitions decisions. It might state different collections categories. If your repository has, for example, a reference collection, an archival collection, a rare books collection, those are 3 discrete collections that might have different uses, purposes, and might have different acquisition criteria. So remember, not everything that is acquired is accessioned. This portion of the policy might also outline guidelines for collections that are not going to be fully accessioned collections, like, for example, perhaps an education collection, a teaching collection, public use collections. So differentiating those from, say, a permanent collection. So some of the questions that you would ask at the point of acquisition are getting into the next topic of appraisal, but before we define that, I'll just list out some of the simplest questions, asking whether the object is consistent with the collection goals of the institution, whether the object is so unusual or interesting or rare that it presents an exceptional opportunity and thus should maybe be given special consideration. If an object is offered for sale, might it be comparable to an object that could otherwise be obtained by gift or bequest? Can proper care be given to the object? So if your institution has made this commitment to collect and care for the material, this is the point at which you would want to ask yourself, can we do that? Is the object more appropriate for another organization? Will the object be used in the foreseeable future, and is there a good faith intention to keep it in the collection? You wouldn't want to go through the whole process of accessioning something that you strongly suspect might be deaccessioned further down the road. Is the provenance of the object satisfactory? Do you know that it's coming from where the donor or seller says that it's coming from? Do you know what the chain of custody in the past of this material has been? Is the object encumbered with conditions? Does the donor have some types of restrictions that they want to place on the donation, like that it can never be used on exhibition, or alternately that it must always be on exhibition? Those are two, for an exhibiting institution, those are two very different sides of the spectrum that might raise some red flags and concerns in considering an acquisition. Is the object encumbered by intellectual property rights? So does the donor, if there are copyright issues involved, does the donor have a clear understanding of what the issues are or what the copyright is, and what is the status of them, if relevant, transferring the copyright to your institution? Will the acceptance of the object result in major future expenses for the institution? Are there extensive conservation issues and treatments that would be necessary down the road? Is it a massive collection that if your organization accepted it, you would be faced with a real space concern in terms of physically storing it? And some of those questions are dealt with during the appraisal phase of the collection's growth process. So after an acquisition comes appraisal. Appraisal is the decision-making period. It's a judgment of what something is worth. So a lot of us are accustomed with hearing the word appraisal in terms of monetary value. So in terms of really assigning a dollar figure to the value of a collection or material in a collection. But we're talking about something a little bit different here. We're talking about the historic research potential or the value of an object or collection to your institution and mission. So this is a very subjective process. It's very specific to each repository because, as we discussed in the beginning, all collections development decisions should really ultimately be focused on whether or not the material fulfills the mission of your organization. So I wanted to just go through some of the different types of appraisal questions and considerations that might be entailed, and define some of those beyond the monetary appraisal. So within appraisal, there is an intellectual appraisal. There's an appraisal of, as I mentioned, the research potential, what you can learn from the material. Within that intellectual value, there's evidential value. That's the primary value, why the material was created in the first place. So perhaps just the actual contents, the concept of records documenting their creator and their activities. The records of a business explain the business operations. That's the evidential value. Informational value is secondary. So that is materials used in a way that the creator never necessarily intended. For example, immigration records. Immigration records, their evidential value, the reason they were originally created was simply to document when someone came into a country, where, and possibly some identifying personal information about that person. But of course, immigration records can be a gold mine for genealogists with a great deal of secondary informational value. A wealth of information on things like someone's children, of course their nationality, their job, their place of birth, their ship name, their age, height, maybe even eye and hair color, the names and addresses of relatives they're joining in the US. So you can see how that information, those types of records, have much broader implications beyond just what they were originally intended to document. Intrinsic value is the value of an item as an object, not necessarily the contents themselves. So it's the difference between the contents, the letter that's written inside the birthday card that you were sent, and the birthday card itself that was maybe hand-drawn by a famous artist. For example, a material that includes an important signature or exists in the author's original handwriting, that has a level of intrinsic value to it. This, like all of them, it can be very, very specific to your institution. Other considerations in the appraisal decision are administrative value, so records and materials that document the actual workings of an organization, financial records, minutes from meetings, etc. Age can be a consideration in the appraisal decision. So for example, you might make an exception about something that you wouldn't normally take, for example, financial records, because it's so old, because it's historically significant. Uniqueness. Of course, if it's a very key existence of this particular type of object or artifact that there are not a number of others of, that's going to be part of the appraisal decision. Condition and other physical considerations, of course, are critical for some of the reasons that we've already talked about before. Accessibility and format considerations. So we talked about how maybe in your collections development policy you would make some limitations about what types of formats you're going to collect because you are confident as an institution that you're not going to be able to provide access. But maybe you might accept something if you're confident that eventually you would reformat it, or if you're confident that you will invest in the future in that playback equipment to access the particular type of audiovisual materials. Ethical considerations are part of appraisal as well, as one ethical consideration is the concept of poaching. So accepting something that you organizationally are quite confident would be much more in the vein of the mission at a different institution. So essentially snatching it out from under a place where a particular collection or material might be more well suited to that collection. So if appraisal is where you decide if you want the material, accessioning is kind of the final step in the process of collections growth. Accessioning a object or collection is the formal process used to legally accept the object and record it as part of a collection. So this is the legal transfer from the donor or seller to the organization. This is when it formally becomes the possession of your organization. At this point, at the point at which you decide to and commit to accession material for your collections, at this point you would then create a permanent record for the object or the collection. Part of that permanent record, part of the object file, would be the deed of gift. This is the document that states that the title and ownership are transferring from the original owner to the institution. So this is the legal document. Going forward, definitely when you're accepting materials for a collection, definitely recommend, ideal, to always complete a deed of gift going forward. If you have donor information for collections that you've received in the past or that you already have but you don't have a deed of gift for, it is possible to go back and retroactively generate a deed of gift for material that doesn't have it, if everyone's on the same page about this being the formal legal transfer. So at this point in the process, when you're actually accessioning something and making that legal transfer, this is when it might sound like it goes without saying, but it certainly has happened to the contrary, that this is when you want to find out for sure that the donor definitely has the legal title to what they're intending on donating, the donor or seller, I should say. So, for example, in the instance of family papers, you might have to, depending on how the ownership is laid out, you might have to get the signatures of, for example, all of the siblings in a family. In order to pass the title along to an institution, the person transferring the title must have a good unrestricted title themselves. So they are making that legal commitment to transferring the title. Some of the other areas that could be articulated on a deed of gift form, other than just the legal transfer of the object or collection, it might have a clause about copyright. And ideally, going forward, I would recommend, if you're in the process of generating new deed of gift forms or updating your deed of gift forms, I would definitely recommend adding a copyright clause on there. Copyright, the clause would basically just state whether, if the donor or seller holds copyright to the material, whether that would be transferred to the institution or not. This is obviously a very complex field, and one that we could certainly spend an entire afternoon in a webinar on, so I'm not going to get into any great detail. I would recommend, if you have questions about copyright, to consult someone with legal authority on copyright, intellectual property, and see just what type of language you might want to have on your deed of gift form. A deed of gift might also include potential restrictions, if there are any restrictions attached to the title transfer. So, for example, if you do want to accept something that has restrictions, it should be articulated here on this form. For example, if the donor or seller doesn't want something publicly available until a certain amount of years after the transfer, in order to respect the privacy of individuals documented within, that could be articulated on this form. And this may be, the deed of gift may be, if there is a monetary appraisal, this might be reflected on the deed of gift form. That might be necessary for the donor's tax purposes, but just be aware that the monetary appraisal would need to be done by a third-party appraiser that the donor selects. So it certainly can't be someone from the institution and can't be an interested party in the transaction. I mentioned that when an item or collection is kind of formally accessioned into a repository, that's when an object record is created. Along with that record should be created an accession number. So this is a unique identifying control number assigned to an object and marked on the object if possible, and used in all documentation. So this is really where the object is going to be able to be tracked from its acquisition to its formal accession, and then through all of the uses in the collection. So throughout inventories, throughout if you're going to do more extensive cataloging. We'll talk a bit more about collections documentation in a few minutes. So what if you are not in that luxuriously simplistic state of just sitting and waiting for collections to come to you through donations? What if, like so many institutions, you're dealing with materials that are there that you just don't already, and you don't necessarily have a clear paper trail on? You don't necessarily know even that your institution has that full, clear legal ownership of the materials. What are the implications there? if you're in that situation, you're not alone. Many, possibly even most institutions have materials within their collections that can be referred to as found in collections. So that's undocumented objects or objects with kind of incomplete documentation that remain without status. So that means that the legal status is not officially known, even with after attempts to reconcile them to existing records of the permanent collection and loan objects are completed. So found in collections could be old loans, could be items that you lost paperwork for, or that incomplete paperwork was done for, or that no paperwork was done for. There was a gentleman's agreement some time ago, or possibly there wasn't even a gentleman's agreement. Possibly material was just dropped off at an institution with an assumption or a hope that the institution would want to hold that material in the collections, and then you have essentially no records. At the end of this presentation, I have a slide with some outside additional resources. One resource that I would really recommend looking into if you have questions about found in collections or what we're going to talk about in a minute, abandoned property, is a book called Collection Conundrums, Solving Collections Management Mysteries, edited by Rebecca A. Buck and Jean Allman Gilmore. You don't have to jot all this down right now because we'll have a slide at the end. But this book, in a very approachable, easy to read, easily digestible manner, lays out some of the options and some of the issues around these really complex, sticky collections issues. But I'm going to talk now about one type of found in collection and the implications therein, and that is abandoned property. So abandoned property are materials that were left by a former owner, whether that's a donor, a lender, etc., who in the practice of leaving the materials with no records and not claiming the property within a reasonable length of time, essentially relinquishes their ownership to the materials. Abandoned property is a matter within collecting institutions that is defined by law in most states. The Society of American Archivists has this link where they go through all of the states that have abandoned property laws and link to those laws and talk about work that's potentially being done to update the laws, what some of the statuses of those are. So what your implications in terms of what your responsibilities and what the steps are to do with abandoned property has entirely to do with what state you're in. And so I'm going to go through just pretty briefly with the major caveat that I am by no means an attorney or legal specialist. I'm going to go through abandoned property situations in the 3 states that we're working with in this region. So Kentucky, Ohio, and West Virginia abandoned property laws. So within Kentucky, I wrote in this slide the law that governs abandoned property at museums, and just to let you know, for those of you not in a museum or what's considered a museum, that's who the language is written for. My understanding is that there are definitions and specifications within these laws as to exactly what constitutes a museum. So if you're wondering if your institution is included there, you might want to do a little more digging. But basically, in Kentucky, if an object has been at your institution unclaimed for 7 years, there are certain steps that you need to publicly take to try to track down the lender. And that's if you know who the lender is, you contact them by certified mail. If you don't know who they are, or if they don't respond, you publish a notice in a newspaper, and then a certain amount of time after those letters and the published notice, the title transfers to the institution. So this is, again, a legal transfer. By pursuing this path of sending the letter and publishing the notice, you're initiating the ownership by the institution of the material, as long as it's been there unclaimed for at least 7 years. The abandoned property law in Ohio is quite similar. It's also a 7-year term. Some of the specifications on how they define the newspaper publication are a little bit different than Kentucky, I think a little more specific. The Ohio law also includes a clause that the Kentucky law I could not explicitly find. Again, not a legal expert, so I'm not saying that definitively, but I could not find a clause in there about indefinite term loans. So this Ohio law articulates the difference between not only kind of abandoned donations, but things that were originally intended to be loans that, again, it's a figure of 7 years. After that term, the loan legally expires and becomes abandoned property. Both of these laws contain clauses about the conservation of abandoned property and kind of the responsibilities and rights that the institution has therein. Bad news, West Virginia, sort of. I mean, unfortunately, no abandoned property law exists specific to cultural collections. You are also not alone. I personally live in New Jersey. My state also does not have an abandoned property law. All that this means is that it's not governed on a statewide level. That doesn't mean that there are not legal arrangements and implications, but just that you would need to, if you really needed to look into the status of materials in your collection, you would need to directly consult an attorney who has some knowledge and expertise there. So basically, you're going to use a risk management due diligence approach to tracking down, if you have any hope at all of knowing who the original donor or lender was, do a due diligence approach to tracking them down, and then proceed accordingly with caution. So we have been talking about what happens in order to build the collections, in order to either accept new materials into our collections or take materials that were already there and kind of formally transfer them into our collections. But what about reducing the collections, getting rid of stuff, for lack of a more formal term? So that happens through deaccessions and disposals. So just to upfront give a really specific differentiation here, you only have to deaccession materials if they have previously been accessioned. So if you have materials on hand that were never incorporated into your collection, let me back up there just a little bit. If you have materials that you know the status of and they were never formally incorporated into your collection, you don't have to go through the whole deaccession process. So if you have materials that were left for your consideration and you never ended up accessioning them, you wouldn't have to then deaccession them. So there are two different definitions here. The deaccession is the permanent removal of previously accessioned materials. If accessioning is the permanent legal transfer, this is the legal transfer out. And disposal is the actual getting rid of the materials. So it's either getting rid of materials after they've been deaccessioned or getting rid of materials that don't need to be deaccessioned. So what are some valid reasons to deaccession material within your collections? So we talked in the collections development section about how it's really important that anything in your collection really strongly fits within your collecting scope. So if it doesn't, that could be a candidate for deaccessioning. Unnecessary duplicates or overrepresentation of a certain type of material or even a certain title itself might be a target for deaccessioning. a change in collecting scope. I see this happen now and then when, for example, a historical society will go from being county-wide to just, say, 2 towns in the county-wide. They've narrowed in their collecting focus. Certainly could happen in the opposite direction. A historical society might go from community-wide to county-wide, but that's in that case, you probably wouldn't be faced with deaccession questions because you're broadening your scope rather than narrowing. But if your organization determines that you're just unable to provide proper care and or access, some of those access considerations that we were talking about before, for example, with digital or audiovisual material. If you have new information regarding the provenance or title, so if maybe that the material was not what it was said to be when it was transferred to you, or on a potentially related note, if the object is determined to be a fake or a forgery. If the material has deteriorated beyond usefulness, so it's just in such poor condition that not only can it not be accessed, but maybe it can't even be reformatted to capture the content. It's a newspaper that has literally crumbled to dust. Or if an object has been stolen or misplaced with no recourse, in order to get the record out of your catalog or your collections records database, you would need to go through the process of formally deaccessioning the material. So if the item is gone and you know you're not getting it back, in order to legally remove it from your collection, you would need to go through the deaccession process. So what are some of the considerations that you need to articulate when defining a deaccession policy for your institution? Well, you might want to list out some of the reasons that you might deaccession materials. You may want to define stipulations and restrictions on, for example, if you would not be willing to deaccession something until it had been in the collection for less than 5 years. That might be spelled out in a policy as well. And then responsibilities and basic procedures should be agreed upon and spelled out in a policy as well. So, for example, what the proper approval needs to be in order to formally deaccession something. Sometimes in order to deaccession something, the question needs to come up in front of a board meeting. You may need to articulate how the clear title will be demonstrated. So you may need to give evidence of the original deed of gift. There would need to be a process for removing accession numbers, so removing all physical indications that the material was part of your collection. You do want to really retain all the documentation and records surrounding the deaccession, just in the interest of thorough and comprehensive record keeping. Just because something has been deaccessioned from the collection doesn't mean that you can just discard all of the paperwork surrounding it. Your policy might include these 2 question mark points here are maybes. Some institutions like to stipulate that the original donor needs to be contacted in the event of a deaccession. I would not at all say this as a mandatory. I might even try to steer clear of it if you can, just because it can create, in potential circumstances, it could create some questions or negative feelings there. But there also might be stipulations that your organization needs to publish a record of the materials that are deaccessioned. For example, in a organization newspaper or in published board minutes or a published annual report or something, just to have that documentation and paper trail in place. So what actually happens when materials are disposed of from the collection? So they may be transferred to another unit within your organization. So for example, transferred from the permanent collections, transferred from the archives or special collections into an educational study or use collection, might be transferred, donated to another institution, might be sold. You know, that's where sometimes the controversial element of deaccessions come in, is when institutions are considering selling them, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but it is an option. And then physically destroyed, and this would really only be in the case of materials with those severe condition problems, conservation issues, or possibly materials that have been determined to be a fake or a forgery. You would actually throw them away. So obviously, as I'm sure anyone who's familiar with deaccessioning knows, there are certainly legal and ethical considerations there. Some of the legal and ethical considerations to think about are there may be provisions in the repository's founding documents or overall policies that disallow deaccessioning. Sometimes it's part of an institution's mandate or mission that once something is accessioned, it will never be removed. So clearly, if you wanted to pursue deaccessioning, you would want to make sure that that's not the case at your institution. Excuse me. It's possible that the original agreement and the deed of gift with the donor might not allow the eventual deaccessioning. Possibly something was accepted with the promise and commitment that it would not be removed from the collection. In the case of living donors, this isn't necessarily a legal consideration, but more of a reputational, friendly communication consideration, an ethical consideration there. Again, as we discussed, whether you would contact them or whether, you know, what their view in terms of donating to your organization might be again. And certainly public relations considerations, if there is a concern about it making your organization look bad to remove materials from the collections, you'd need to consider that as well. Who can obtain deaccessioned materials? So there, if you're articulating a deaccession policy, you should articulate in there that ideally that staff, board, and volunteers are not able to take the deaccession materials. So that's disallowing the problem of, you know, someone choosing to deaccession a material from the repository in the interest of obtaining it themselves. An ethical consideration for sure. If you are going to sell the material, the sale should be done by a third party to maintain impartiality, and often it's stipulated that it should be in a public sale as well, not a private sale to simply another individual or collecting repository. And then deaccessioning undocumented objects. So this is getting back to sort of the found in collections issues and possibly even abandoned properties. It's complicated. The responsibility is not always clear, and unfortunately, if you don't know the status of a material, an object, you can't technically deaccession it, because technically deaccessioning something is, again, removing material from the collection that you have accessioned. So in the case of abandoned property, if you wanted to get rid of it, the object, you could only get rid of it after you've gone through all of those steps to pursue the abandoned property title transfer and then formally transferred it to the ownership of your institution. So it's complicated. Ideally, this is another case in which I would really recommend, if you desperately need to get rid of this stuff that you don't know the status of and think that there might be concerns, risks, or controversy, contact a lawyer. The proceeds from deaccessions, I mentioned if the material is being sold, basically, in short, the proceeds from deaccessions should go back into the good of the collections that are there, some form of bolstering the collections that are indeed permanent and mission critical. The interpretation of this can vary quite widely, so it can be anything from purchase of other additional collections, conservation treatment for collections that are permanently in place, conservation and preservation supplies, could even be interpreted to go towards technology for regulating the climate, so environmental controls, even towards staff training, development, consultants. But basically, it should be used for the direct care of permanent collections that are in place and in keeping with the mission of the institution. So I'm going to talk a little bit about documentation, record keeping. Documentation is an institution's memory. This is what's sometimes known as intellectual control. Managing cultural collections is all about organizing them in an understandable way that will be useful to you and others, that's staff and other users, enable you to find and access ideally any object at a moment's notice, and enable you to connect each object to its paperwork, including when the material came to the institution and from whom, the formal legal transfer of the title, a history of the object, the record of the object while it's been at the repository, and whether the object has been borrowed or transferred to another institution. So this slide here is just listing some of the many different types of documentation records that might be in place. I'm going to go just pretty quickly through some methods of describing the collections and documenting the collections scope as they stand in as part of the repository. So all objects in a collecting repository should have some sort of documented history that, as we mentioned, gives all of those details about what it is, where it came from, etc. Some of this type of documentation will come from the donor or from the former owner from whom you acquired the object. Some of it will come from research done once the object is part of the collection. When an object does not have this type of documentation, its value to your organization is really diminished because you essentially don't know what it is or don't have a full and accurate description of what it is. So these records, the many different types of records that we saw in the last slide, would be kept in an object file and would be part of a permanent documentation that you should keep about your collection. So as I mentioned, this slide is explaining 3 different types of forms of describing the collections. These definitions are from the Society of American Archivists glossary, so they're a bit archives oriented rather than museum or historic collection oriented, but I do think that they give a sense of kind of different levels of description. They should probably be reordered on this slide for a finding aid to be kind of the most intensive level of description of a collection. It's a description of records that gives physical and intellectual control over the materials, so describing physically what comprises a collection and intellectually what the contents are of the collection. And it really helps users gain access to and understand the materials. So a finding aid is really a guide to using a collection of materials. A catalog is simply a collection of somehow systematically arranged descriptions of materials. And so the description of the materials is what's really key there. A finding aid doesn't go as far as, a catalog doesn't go as far as a finding aid in kind of assisting someone with actually using the materials, but does describe them. And then an inventory, I have kind of a very simplistic definition up here, a list of things, but that's really what it is. It doesn't necessarily include too much descriptive information. An inventory is a formal list of the property in a repository connecting the physical object to a location or number in the catalog or other formal record. So the inventory is where that object accession record would be, that object or accession number that we talked about in the accession process would be tied to a physical location of the object on a shelf or in storage otherwise. So there are some different types of inventories that you can take. Basically, the process of taking an inventory is to determine all of the objects in the collection to some extent. The level of detail, the level of description, and further intellectual control can really vary based on the purpose and type of inventory being taken. Some of the different types of inventories that you can take are listed up here on the slide. A transmittal inventory, so an inventory of an acquisition, essentially. A time-based inventory, so moving through a collections storage space, for example, on a set time frame, for example, once a year, once every 5 years, and basically seeing what's there and recording it. A random sample or spot inventory, a section inventory or inventory of one collection, one physical area, or one particular exhibit, or the greatest extent, a complete wall-to-wall inventory. So some of the different uses of an inventory, I'm just going to go ahead and list some of them here. To determine locations of objects, to determine the exact number of objects, to estimate space needs, potentially for renovation or moving, for security of the collections, and building off of that to determine what has potentially been lost, missing, misplaced, or even stolen. To retrieve information after a catastrophic loss, so after an emergency or disaster that impacts the collection, you would definitely want to take an inventory. To determine what objects are not cataloged or have incomplete records. So if you're going to be embarking on a further description or cataloging process, you would want to start with an inventory to see what still needs to be done. To determine what you actually collect and then potential holes in your collection, and both of those might be to help define or refine your collecting plan. To determine budget requirements for housing or preservation or conservation needs. To identify objects for deaccession. To determine insurance needs. You might need certain object counts or material counts in order to have an accurate and detailed insurance policy. And certainly for different matters in aiding research within the collections. Moving on to discussing loans. So again, towards the beginning, we saw the sample table of contents from a collections management policy, and perhaps you noticed that that includes loans in there too. So we're just going to be talking about collections management-wise, some of the different considerations to make when dealing with outgoing loans, that is, loaning materials from your collection to another institution, and then correspondingly, incoming loans, so borrowing materials from another institution. A loan policy in terms of outgoing loans would articulate these points up here on the slide: to whom an institution will make loans, and potentially if there are certain types of institutions or certain parties to which your institution would not make loans. That might be articulated there too. If you would, for example, many, perhaps your organization would only loan materials to other nonprofits with a collecting mission similar to your museums, for example, or only to other nonprofits. Your loan materials will not be used in a store window. Restricting some collections materials from loans if there are certain collections that are just so mission critical or are really integral to your institution's exhibitions. You wouldn't want to loan those out and have them off-site. Acceptable purposes for loaned materials. Can materials be handled? Can materials be transported from multiple institutions to another, so a traveling loan, for example? What are the requirements of the borrower in terms of preservation, conservation, insurance? The length of the loan, you definitely want to stipulate a set length, and if it's too short, it can always be renegotiated. So err on the side of too short rather than too long. What loan documentation needs to be in place? What will happen if the material is damaged when it's on loan? So does the borrowing institution have permission to perform emergency conservation, and what's entailed in that? Do they need to contact you first? Will they only be able to use conservators that your institution has identified as on a particular list? Will they be responsible for packing, transportation, and insurance, and what are the implications there? You also just need to consider other kind of maybe less clearly definable issues when you're considering materials that to go out on loan. Issues of condition, whether the object can't necessarily stand the rigors of transport or being exhibited at another organization. Monetary value, maybe if you have had a monetary appraisal done, you would not want to loan the items in your collection of the greatest monetary significance. If there's a donor restriction placed on, potentially the donor gives you the object with the stipulation that you cannot loan it out to other organizations. In terms of incoming loans, there's a different kind of risk assumed. I can't say less risk assumed, certainly less risk to your own permanent collections, but you are still assuming some risk there. So some of the things that you would want to articulate in an incoming loan policy are very similar to what you would articulate in the outgoing loan policy, but kind of from the different side of the discussion. So why materials may be borrowed? Would your institution only borrow materials for exhibition, or are we talking about your staff research or patron research? Who may request materials to borrow? So whose responsibility is it at your organization to initiate that loan request? And then again, what will you do? What will your organization do in terms of emergency conservation, packing, transportation, insurance, documentation? Will you be taking photographs? Will you be filling out condition reports before and after the object goes up on exhibition, and then again when it comes down? And again, in this side of things too, you want to articulate a set duration of the loan, so it's not indefinite. Because as much as we possibly can, we want to steer clear from indefinite term loans. So there's somewhat of a difference between indefinite term loans and deposit agreements. I'm not going to get as deep into deposit agreements this afternoon, but in short, a deposit agreement is somewhat of a long-term loan, but where For example, an owner of material, whether it's an institution or organization or an individual, has an agreement with an organization to keep their material there at that organization because the organization can take better care of it than the owner. Those deposit agreements ideally will be formally articulated. So ideally there will be a formal record of the stipulations, terms, responsibilities, etc. What you want to steer clear from are the truly indefinite loans, the quote-unquote permanent loans. John Simmons, who wrote another really great publication that I'll include on the resource slide called Things Great and Small, Collections Management Policies, has somewhat of a cheeky definition in his glossary here, where he describes a permanent loan as an oxymoron used in reference to a loan with no specified ending date. So they're tricky, they're complicated. The responsibilities, unless I mentioned in the case of really well articulated deposits, the responsibilities are unclear. Ideally, going forward, it's much easier on everyone's behalf, the lender and the borrower, to either have terms for your loans clearly in place, clearly articulated, and have an end date so a loan is not permanent or indefinite, or describe the responsibilities and deposit arrangements so well that there can be no unclear source of responsibility, no unclear questions of responsibility or source of confusion there. Unsolicited deposits are essentially doorstop donations, and I suspect that many of your organizations are familiar with those. You arrive to the institution one morning and discover, oh, a box of quote-unquote collections. What do we do with these? Well, legally, formally, they would at some point turn into abandoned property. But again, it's all about taking kind of a risk management approach as to how you think the quote-unquote donor would expect and want the materials to be dealt with, the level of formality that they would expect. So the final thing we're going to talk about before we have a bit of time for questions through the chat box is how some of these decisions are actually made. And one great way of making and articulating and sharing these decisions and actions that we've been discussing this afternoon is by having a collections committee in place. A collections committee can really remove the burden of sometimes tough decisions from the collection staff and volunteers themselves. It can give you a way to gracefully not accept donations when you're essentially the last stop on the way to the junkyard. It can also be a way to efficiently shape and form your collection so that it meets your mission. Having a collections committee in place can be a vital outreach service organized to promote the awareness of the resources, programs, and common concerns of your institution. So individuals serving on the committee could be advocates for your collection. If you are going to have a collections committee in place that is responsible for making some of these decisions and has authority over these decisions, there should certainly be a provision in your collections management policy stating that the committee will, for example, evaluate and accept objects and other materials presented to your organization. Of course, this written policy would have no teeth unless you actually adopt the committee in fact, so put together the collections committee itself. What are some of the duties of the collections committee? To make decisions to accept or reject objects offered for the collection, such as whether the object fits the collection, whether the object adds something to the collection that you don't already have, what condition is the object in, so if it's in bad condition or needs conservation attention, the committee might weigh in on whether It might be an exception to the rule in terms of accepting things that are in very poor condition. Maybe the committee would state that it's such an exceptional offering that you would want to take it and pursue conservation treatment. The committee might have discussions about how much it would cost to preserve the object, and can your organization afford to care for it properly. If the object fulfills part of that criteria above, or there are additional reasons why you might not choose to accept it. Can an object which might not be sufficient for the permanent collection be used in some other way by the organization? So as an exhibit prop, or as a demonstration object, or part of the education or use collections. A collections committee would make sure the institution adheres to the highest ethical standards, so they should serve as somewhat of a liaison between the repository and its collections and professional mandates and standards that govern collections care. They can also perform outreach, research, and advocacy for the collection, not only in terms of building the collections, but possibly even cultivating donors as well. And given the backgrounds and purpose of the collections committee, might discuss exhibition considerations as well. So some of the individuals that might serve on a collections committee, certainly there should be some staff or volunteer staff representation, probably the curator, the special collections librarian, the archivist, the collections manager, the person with the most direct collections responsibility. Board members, a collections committee does not have to be comprised entirely of board members, but it's fantastic if there is board representation. Administration, so an executive director, a dean, someone with oversight over the collections, and then possibly outside experts like a preservation professional, a subject expert, possibly even representative users. I'm on the collections committee for the archive of a community organization locally where I live, and I serve in the role as the preservation professional. But there are subject experts. There is one person, it's mostly a community organization documenting a particular community, but the organization has a small art collection as well. So there's an artist on the collections committee representing that role and perspective. There are other professionals, archivists from other institutions. So that's just an example of some of the types of individuals that might serve on that type of committee. So final content slide here is some of the resources that I mentioned previously. I would highly recommend checking out some or all of these publications. Definitely the Collections Conundrums is a fantastic resource to look if you have some of those kind of complex, sticky questions about collections management and care. MRM5, the Museum Registration Methods, is a bit more technical, but it's quite comprehensive about collections management and registration at a museum. Registration Methods for the Small Museum is an excellent kind of beginner publication, particularly aimed at smaller institutions, but I have to give the caveat that it's a bit dated. At 11 years old, some things can be fantastic, wonderful references when they're 30 years old. But this particular case, there are just some sections that are especially about computer registration methods and stuff that are at this point a bit rusty. And then Things Great and Small, Collections Management Policies is a great resource if you are working on developing or updating a written collections management policy. This book really pulls apart every section of a collections management policy and gives great descriptions, examples, and even sample policies, which would help if you're starting from scratch or if you're doing kind of a holistic revamp. Highly recommend checking this out. And with that, I was going to go to questions, but want to just real quick let you know that all of this information is up on the website, but coming next in terms of the Regional Heritage Stewardship Program, in August we have 2 more webinars planned, one on advocating for collections care and also a frequently asked questions session for our Preservation Needs Assessment application program, which is out now. And then our next round of in-person programs, registration is, we haven't started promoting them yet, but registration is actually live on our website. So we're going to be back in Ohio and West Virginia this time in mid-October to learn about a bit more about policies and procedures as well as risk assessments. And with that, I am happy to take questions through the chat box. I'm going to try to switch the screen here so the chat box is a little more front and center. So hopefully this is going to work for everyone. So if you have questions, please type them out in the chat box. You'll see my contact information towards the bottom there. Towards the bottom left, there are some links out to sample policies from other institutions, as well as links to both the section on our website about this program and initiative overall, and also the program calendar where you can now register for those in-person October workshops as well. So one person asked if the slides are going to be available from the webinar. The entire webinar will be recorded, and a link to the recording will be available. As far as actually distributing the slides themselves, I'm not quite sure yet. We might be able to find a way to have them available at a secure link, but there might be some intellectual property issues in actually sending them out. So yeah, recording is fine, and yes, a recording will be available. It'll be up on that RHSP website after a few days. We just need to build a new section on that website for all of the recordings, but it'll be there as well. Meredith asks, should an accession number be placed permanently on an object using something like a Sharpie, or should it be removable using something like a pencil? I would actually advocate for something somewhere in between. So not permanently. So you don't want to mark with something with a permanent marker or a type of paint that is not easily removable. That said, you do want to make sure that the marking is going to stay on. So you want to make sure that it's in a medium that's perhaps a little more durable than a pencil. There are particular types of, there's a particular type of paint. It's a white paint that's recommended for objects for marking on artifacts, and I can get the exact specifications on that and send them out separately. I don't want to quote any specifications off the top of my head without being really thorough, but I'll make a note and send that out separately. As far as now, I'm thinking about objects like museum artifacts, objects, artworks, you know, things that are 3D objects, for lack of a better word. If you're dealing with paper-based materials, if you're dealing with folders in an archival collection, or even boxes in a library or archival collection, marking on those in pencil is perfectly sufficient and acceptable. Any other questions? It looks like maybe someone else is typing. You can certainly follow up at any time with me over email with additional questions. And again, I'll give another plug. We sent out some information fairly recently with the link to this webinar, so hopefully many of you saw that, about the Preservation Needs Assessment program, where someone from the Conservation Center, as part of this initiative, would come to your institution and do a full day assessment of your organization's preservation needs and deliver a report with recommendations after that, all completely free. So applications are available for that right now on our website, at the RHSP website. So Sharon asks, we often get donations through the mail. Should we be sending a deed of gift back to them with our gift letter? Yes, that would be wonderful. That's a great way to handle it. Especially if you are sending a gift letter, go ahead and send a deed of gift. Send 2 copies of one. Ask them to complete 1 copy and send it back, and keep the other for their records. And then that way, that would be certainly, if you think that your donor base are going to follow up on that, that would certainly be a great way of handling it. Oh, that's a wonderful question, Meredith. So Meredith asks, should we be accessioning found in collections? So in short, no, you can't legally, confidently take that technical formal step of accessioning found in collections. That said, that does not mean that you don't want to make some record of and have some documentation of found in collections. So you can't accession, make that legal step, unless you go through the process, the abandoned property process. But if you do want to catalog or make some other record of found in collections, what I would recommend is, if you're assigning accession numbers or object numbers to other materials in your collection, choose some way of differentiating a found in collection object number from the others in your collection and catalog them accordingly. So for example, many organizations will start an object number with the year that it was donated. So 2017.1.83. For found in collections, instead of that 2017, you might begin your accession, or excuse me, your object number with the letters FIC, or even the letter X, or some, whatever, some identifier that's going to keep them separate from the other object numbers in the collection. But if you want to keep them around, if they are, if you want them documented and you want them incorporated into some collections documentation, you absolutely can and should make record of them. You just have to be consistent in differentiating them from the permanent collections. All right. Any other questions before we're kind of formally at the end of our scheduled time here? It's 3:30, so I know that some of you may have to run. But if there are no other questions, I want to thank all of you for bearing with me as I used this new software this afternoon. Hopefully everything went smoothly. It went reasonably smoothly on my end, so hopefully it was the same for you. And we hope to see you again. We're going to be sending out information shortly on our next webinar, which, as I mentioned, is going to be all about advocating for collections care, not only advocating in terms of funding and, making the case to funders, to legislators and foundations and funding agencies, but even just advocating within your organization. So making the case up to your administration and directors, etc., for the importance of collections preservation and the importance of caring for your collections, basically, and all of the different types of actions that might be entailed in that. We have The Conservation Center's Director of Development and our Director of Communications and Marketing will be speaking in that webinar. So thank you all for your time this afternoon. The links to the recording will be going out shortly, and I can also, with that, send out links to information about appropriate marking materials for artifacts, because I didn't have that closely at hand with me this afternoon. And with that, I hope you all have a great rest of your Wednesday afternoon, and you will be hearing from me again. Thanks.